The sun rose over Ouagadougou like fire licking the horizon. Golden light spilling across red soil, busy streets, and a people already on their feet before the day had even begun. But this morning wasn't like any other, because somewhere between the chatter of street markets and the hum of motorcycle engines, a single sentence from 8,000 kilometers away detonated across every phone screen in Burkina Faso. It came from Moscow, delivered with a smirk. And it changed everything. During a live press conference, President Vladimir Putin had laughed, and then said it. "Traoré? A clown in uniform pretending to be a president." The words sliced through the internet like a blade. Every notification that buzzed carried the insult deeper into the heart of Africa. A digital grenade that exploded not just in headlines, but in people's pride. Taxi drivers pulled to the side of the road. Vendors stopped mid-sale. Office workers froze at their desks. Even the hum of conversation at Café Renaissance, usually full of laughter and music, turned into silence thick enough to taste. And then the silence cracked. "A clown?" shouted Amina, a university student clutching her phone. "He's the man who kicked out the French. The man feeding our children. How dare he?" Her voice carried through the cafe, and something ancient stirred in the crowd. The same fire that burned during the days of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who'd once taught this land that dignity is worth dying for. In that moment, every Burkinabe felt it, that this insult wasn't aimed at one man. It was a shot fired at an entire generation of Africans who dared to stand on their own feet. Inside the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly, the insult replaying on his screen. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were hard as forged steel. Around him, his advisers seethed with anger. "Mr. President," whispered Defense Minister Kassoum, "he thinks we're still in the era where a white man's words can crush an African leader." But Traoré didn't flinch. He simply raised his hand, calm, controlled. Outside his window, the soil of Burkina Faso stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The same earth that once held Sankara's blood, the same ground that had never bowed to any empire. And quietly, in that office, a storm began to form. Long before Putin's insult echoed around the globe, there was just a boy named Ibrahim. He grew up in a tiny village called Bondokwi, a place without electricity, without privilege, but full of dignity. His father, a farmer, sold his best goat just to buy his son a stack of school books. "Learn," he told him. "Learn so they can never chain your mind." And Ibrahim did. By candlelight under a mango tree, he devoured lessons about history and leadership. Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. Men who fought giants and spoke truth to power. He watched foreign soldiers roll through his village in armored trucks, their flags flying high like reminders of who truly controlled African soil. He never forgot that feeling. At military academy, he wasn't just another cadet. He studied warfare, yes, but also economics, psychology, propaganda. He wanted to understand not just how empires conquered, but why they stayed in control. He rose through the ranks not because of connections, but competence, leading missions against extremists in the Sahel, shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. He slept in the same tents, ate the same rations, and bled the same blood. When Burkina Faso's government collapsed under corruption in 2022, it wasn't foreign aid that saved the country. It was a generation of young soldiers who said, "Enough," at just 34. Ibrahim Traoré became Africa's youngest head of state, not through privilege, but through purpose. And instead of speeches, he made moves. He expelled foreign troops that had occupied Burkinabe soil for decades. He cut unfair mining contracts. He redirected gold profits toward schools and hospitals. He refused the limousines, the luxury villas, the empty pomp of power. He wore his military uniform like armor, not against bullets, but against corruption, and that's the man Putin called a clown. In Moscow, Putin's advisors thought they understood Africa. They believed young leaders like Traoré were pawns to be moved, first by France, now by Russia. They thought they could dangle weapons and promises the same way colonial powers had dangled civilization. They didn't realize that Africa had changed. The insult wasn't an accident. It was strategy, an attempt to humiliate, to remind Africa who the real powers were. But it backfired instantly, because this wasn't the 20th century. This was a world of smartphones, solidarity, and sovereignty. Within hours, hashtags like Respect Africa and Stand with Traoré trended worldwide. Russian propaganda accounts tried to drown the outrage, but they couldn't. In Lagos, a journalist tweeted, "Putin made the same mistake as Napoleon. He underestimated those he thought beneath him." In Paris, the African diaspora flooded the streets. In Nairobi, students rallied with signs that read, "We are not clowns. We are the future." By the second day, African presidents were calling each other privately. "Let's wait," they agreed. "Let Traoré move first." The silence from Ouagadougou became deafening. No statements, no anger, no reaction, just quiet. The kind that makes your enemies sweat. On the third day, the silence broke, not with words, but with action. Burkina Faso announced it was cutting off all security talks with Russia. Then came the bombshell. Leaked documents showing Russian intermediaries had tried to bribe Burkinabe officials for exclusive mining rights, at prices even worse than what the French once offered. Emails, receipts, recordings. It was all there. Proof that while Russia pretended to be Africa's ally, it was planning to exploit the continent just like everyone else. And then came Traoré himself. He didn't hold a fiery press conference. He didn't shout or posture. He simply appeared on screen, calm, composed, and devastatingly clear. "Maybe President Putin is right," he began. "Maybe I am a clown. Because I refuse to perform in the circus of global powers. I will not be anyone's puppet. Not Paris's, not Moscow's, not Washington's. I choose Burkina Faso. I choose sovereignty." Those words rippled across the planet. You could feel the tremor through every news broadcast, every social feed. He didn't just defend himself. He defended the idea that no nation, no matter how small, should bow to another. Within hours, the dominoes began to fall. Mali released its own documents exposing Russian mercenaries and their exploitative deals. Chad revealed threats from Moscow demanding access to minerals. Suddenly, Putin's entire Africa strategy was unraveling, not because of military might, but because of moral exposure. In Senegal, the president appeared on TV beside a portrait of Sankara and said, "An insult to one African leader is an insult to all Africans." In Nigeria, the foreign minister summoned the Russian ambassador, and the video of that meeting went viral. Across the continent, youth movements filled the streets, not with violence but with pride. They marched with signs that said, "Africa is not your playground, musicians." From 15 nations collaborated on a song called "No More Masters." African American. Activists in the U.S. linked Traoré's resistance to the long struggle against racial injustice. The movement was no longer about one insult. It was about centuries of them. Even in Moscow, African students staged silent protests holding signs that read, "We are not clowns." The Kremlin didn't know what to do. Arrest them and risk global outrage? Ignore them and look weak? Either way, the image spread. Students standing in the snow, silent, proud, unbroken. It was the picture of dignity they had tried to mock. Western media that had barely mentioned Traoré before now couldn't stop talking. About him, CNN called him the leader who turned an insult into a revolution. The New York Times headline read, "How a 35-year-old African captain outsmarted the Kremlin." BBC ran week-long specials about Africa's new political generation. Even European commentators, usually blind to African brilliance, admitted it. Putin had made one of the biggest diplomatic mistakes of his career, and in the halls of the United Nations, something subtle but seismic happened. Small nations, the ones usually ignored, began referencing Burkina Faso when demanding respect from superpowers. Latin American and Asian diplomats quoted Traoré's words in their own speeches. He had done what no global leader from a small nation had done in decades. He'd flipped the script. As the backlash grew, the Kremlin scrambled. Spokespeople backtracked, claiming Putin's comments were taken out of context. Russian media tried spinning the story, painting Traoré as unstable. But no one bought it. The truth was too visible. Russia's partnerships began collapsing overnight. Chad suspended Wagner Group talks. Mali distanced itself. Even the Central African Republic, long seen as Moscow's ally, erupted in protests demanding transparency. Inside Russia itself, young Africans studying abroad recorded videos saying, "We came here seeking knowledge, not condescension." Their calm defiance went viral. In just 1 week, the man who had mocked Africa had become the punchline of his own arrogance, and through it all, Traoré said almost nothing. No rants. No rage, just strategy. While Moscow shouted, he played chess, and he won without moving a single piece loudly, analysts around the world called it asymmetric diplomacy. A masterclass in how a small nation can outthink a superpower. He turned an insult into an opportunity, silence into strength, humiliation into history. The European Union, sensing the shift, rushed to open new partnerships with Burkina Faso. Japan sent a delegation promising direct investment. Canada and Brazil followed. For the first time in decades, foreign nations came to Africa not to dictate, but to negotiate. Inside Burkina Faso, the response was electric. People who once doubted the military transition now spoke with pride. Market women told customers, "Our captain stood tall against Moscow." Even opposition leaders admitted, "He made us proud to be Burkinabe." The insult had united the nation. Historians will say that Putin's words, meant to humiliate, instead lit the fuse of a new African century, because after that, everything changed. France pulled more troops from the Sahel. China softened its tone on partnerships. Even U.S. diplomats received new training, how to engage African nations as equals, not subordinates. The message was clear: Africa doesn't need permission anymore. It demands respect, and it started with one man, one so-called clown, who refused to kneel. From that day on, a generation across Africa called themselves the Sovereignty Generation. Young people updated their bios with the phrase, "No more masters." They saw in Ibrahim Traoré not just a president, but a mirror. Proof that leadership could be clean, courageous, and unapologetically African. In schools across Ouagadougou, teachers used his story to explain what dignity means. In the diaspora, artists, writers, and activists carried his message like a torch. And across the world, people realized something powerful. When Africa stands, the world shifts. It started with an insult. It ended with a revolution of respect. Putin thought he was mocking a man. He ended up awakening a continent, and Traoré, calm, strategic, and unbroken, proved that dignity is the strongest weapon a nation can wield. No bombs. No armies, just truth. Because the moment you refuse to be anyone's puppet, that's when freedom begins. So now, I'll leave you with this question. When a small nation can stand up to a superpower with nothing but courage and conviction, what's stopping the rest of the world from doing the same? Drop your thoughts below. This is Traoré versus America. And we'll keep telling the stories they don't want you to hear.